A Commentary on the Stranger by Jean-Paul Sartre. Camus' The Stranger had scarcely been in print before it attracted a great deal of attention. People kept saying that it was the best book since the end of the war. Among the literary productions of its time, the novel was itself a stranger. It came to us from the other side of the horizon, the other side of the sea. In that bitter spring without coal, it spoke to us of the sun, not as some exotic wonder, but in a tone of weary familiarity used by people who have indulged in it too much. It did not set out to rebury the old regime on its own say-so, or to fill us with feelings of our own unworthiness. While reading this book, we recalled that there had once been works that did not attempt to prove anything, content just to stand on their own merits. But this novel's gratuitousness was also accompanied by a certain ambiguity. What were we to make of this character who, on the day after his mother's death, went swimming, began a pointless affair, went to the movies to see a comedy, killed an Arab because of the sun, claimed, on the eve of his execution, that he had been happy and still was, and he hoped there would be lots of spectators around the scaffold to welcome him with cries of hatred? He's a nut. A poor fool, some people said, while others, more insightful, said he's an innocent. The significance of this innocence was not yet understood. In the myth of Sisyphus, which appeared a few months later, Camus provided us with a precise commentary on his work. His hero was neither good nor bad, neither moral nor immoral. Such categories do not apply to him. He belongs to a very particular species for which the author reserves the name absurd. But in Camus' work, this word takes on two very different meanings. The absurd is both a factual state and the lucid awareness that some people acquire from that state. The absurd man is one who does not hesitate to draw inevitable conclusions from a fundamental absurdity. In this we find the same displacement of meaning as when we give the name swing to the young generation that dances to swing music. What, then, does absurd mean? As a factual state or as a set of givens? Nothing less than man's relationship to the world. Primary absurdity manifests itself as a schism, the schism between man's aspirations for unity and the insurmountable dualism of mind and nature, between man's drive to attain the eternal and the finite nature of his existence, between the concern that constitutes his very essence and the vanity of his efforts. Death, the irreducible pluralism of truths and of beings, the unintelligibility of reality, chance. These are the core components of the absurd. These themes are not really very new, and Camus does not present them as such. They had been explored as early as the 17th century through a dry, plain, and contemplative rationalism, which is typically French, and in which they found expression as platitudes of classical pessimism. Was it not Pascal who stressed that the natural misfortune of our mortal and feeble condition is so wretched that when we consider it closely, nothing can console us? Was it not he who put reason in its place? Would he not have enthusiastically approved of this comment by Camus? The world is neither totally rational nor so irrational. Does he not show us that custom and diversion conceal from man his nothingness, his forlornness, his inadequacy, his impotence, and his emptiness? By dint of the impersonal style used in the myth of Sisyphus, and the themes explored in his essay, Camus must be placed in the great tradition of those French moralists whom Charles Andler has rightly called Nietzsche's precursors. As for the doubts that he has raised about the scope of our reasoning powers, they are in line with the most recent tradition of French epistemology. If we consider scientific nominalism, Poincaré, Duhem, and Meyerson, it is easier for us to understand the reproach made by our author against modern science. You tell me of an invisible planetary system in which electrons revolve around a nucleus. You explain the world to me by means of an image. I realize then that you have arrived at a poetic understanding of things. This idea was also expressed, almost at the same time, by another writer who was drawing from the same material when he wrote, "Physics uses mechanical, dynamic, or even psychological models indifferently. as if, liberated from ontological pretensions, it were indifferent to the classical antinomies of mechanism or dynamism which imply a nature in itself. Camus seems to pride himself on quoting Jaspers, Heidegger, and Kierkegaard, whom he seems not to have always truly understood, but his real masters are to be found elsewhere. The way in which he reasons, the clarity of his ideas, the cut of his essayistic style, and a certain kind of solar, orderly, ceremonious, and desolate melancholy all reveal a classical temperament, a Mediterranean. His very method, only through a balance of evidence and lyricism can we simultaneously achieve emotion and lucidity, brings to mind the old passionate geometries of Pascal and Rousseau, and relate him, for example, far more to Charles Maurras, that other Mediterranean from whom he nonetheless differs in so many respects, than to a German phenomenologist or a Danish existentialist. But Camus would no doubt be willing to agree with all this. As he sees it, his originality lies in stretching his ideas to the limit. Indeed, his aim is not to produce a collection of pessimistic maxims. The absurd, to be sure, resides neither in man nor in the world, if one considers each separately, but since man's essential nature is being in the world, the absurd is ultimately an inseparable part of the human condition. Thus, the absurd is not at all primarily the object of a simple notion. It is revealed to us in a bleak light. Get up, take subway, work 4 hours at the office or plant, eat, take subway, work 4 hours, eat, sleep, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, Saturday, always the same routine. And then suddenly, the stage set collapses, and we are immersed in hopeless lucidity. So if we manage to reject the misleading promises of religion or existential philosophies, we come into possession of certain basic truths. The world is chaos, a divine equivalence born of anarchy, and tomorrow does not exist, since we all die. In a universe suddenly deprived of illusions and enlightenment, man feels like a stranger. This exile is irrevocable, since he has no memories of a lost homeland, nor any hope of a promised land. That is because man is not the world. If I were a tree among other trees, this life would have a meaning, or rather this problem would have none, for I would be part of this world. I would be this world in opposition to which I now find myself, as a fully conscious being. It is this preposterous reason that sets me against all of creation. The latter partially explains the title of Camus' novel. The stranger is man confronting the world. Camus could just as well have chosen for the title of this novel the name of a work by George Gissing, Born in Exile. The stranger is also a man among men. There are days when you find that the person you've loved has become a stranger. The stranger is, finally, myself in relation to myself. That is, natural man in relation to mind. The stranger who, at certain moments, confronts us in a mirror. But it is more than that. There is a passion of the absurd. The absurd man will not commit suicide. He wants to live without relinquishing any of his certainty, without a future, without hope, without illusion, and without resignation either. The absurd man asserts himself by revolting. He stares at death with passionate attention, and this fascination liberates him. He experiences the divine irresponsibility of a man sentenced to die. Since God does not exist and we all must die, everything is permissible. One experience is as good as another, so what matters is simply to acquire as many of them as possible. For the absurd man, the ideal is the present, and the succession of present moments before an ever-conscious spirit. Confronted with this quantitative ethic, all value collapses. Projected into this world, the absurd man, rebellious and irresponsible, has nothing to prove. He is innocent as Somerset Maugham's primitive tribesmen before the clergyman comes to teach them good and evil, what is permitted and what is forbidden. For this man, everything is permissible. He is as innocent as Prince Mishkin, who lives in a perpetual present, tinged with smiles and indifference, innocent in every sense of the word, an idiot, too, if you like. And now we finally understand the title of Camus' novel. The stranger he wants to portray is precisely one of those terrible idiots who shock a society by not accepting the rules of its game. He lives among strangers, but he is a stranger to them too. That is why some people grow fond of him, like Marie, his mistress, who likes him because he's odd. Others, like the courtroom crowd whose hatred he feels suddenly rising against him, hate him for the same reason. And we ourselves, opening the book, and being not yet familiar with the feeling of the absurd, will try in vain to judge him according to our customary standards. For us, too, he is a stranger. Thus the shock you felt when you first opened the book and read, "It occurred to me that anyway, one more Sunday was over, that Mamma was buried now, that I would go back to work, and that really nothing had changed," was intentional. It was the result of your first encounter with the absurd, but you were probably hoping, as you continued reading the book, that your uneasiness would fade, everything would gradually become clear, be made reasonable, and explained. Your hopes were dashed. The Stranger is not a book that explains anything. The absurd man does not explain, he describes. Nor is it a book that proves anything. Camus merely presents something and is not concerned about justifying what is fundamentally unjustifiable. The myth of Sisyphus will later teach us to interpret our author's novel. It is in the latter that we discover the theory of the absurd novel. Although the absurdity of the human condition is its sole theme, it is not a novel with a political or social message. It is not the product of a smug kind of thinking, intent on supplying formal proofs, but, to the contrary, the product of a limited, mortal, and rebellious thought. The novel's very existence is proof of the futility of rational reasoning. The choice that great novelists have made to rely on images rather than on arguments reveals a certain kind of idea that they all shared, a conviction of the futility of all explanatory principles and of the communicative power of words that appeal to the senses. Thus, the very fact that Camus delivers his message in the form of a novel reveals a proud humility. This is not resignation, but an outraged acknowledgement of the limitations of human thought. It is true that he felt obliged to make a philosophical translation of his fictional message. The myth of Sisyphus is precisely that, and we shall see later how we are to interpret the relationship of these two works. But, in any event, the presence of the translation does not alter the gratuitousness of the novel. The writer of the absurd has, indeed, lost even the illusion that his work is necessary. On the contrary, he wants us to be constantly aware of its contingent nature. As its epigraph, he would have us write, "might not have been," just as Gide wished his readers would envision at the end of The Counterfeiters, "may be continued." This novel might not have been, any more than this or that stone, stream, or face. It is a present that simply refers itself, like all other presents in this world. It does not even have this subjective necessity that artists readily claim for their works when they say, "I had to write it, I had to get it off my chest." In this book, we re-encounter one of the themes of surrealist terrorism filtered through the light of a classic sun. A work of art is only a page, torn from a life. It expresses this life, of course, but it could have very well not expressed it. No matter, for everything has the same value, whether it be writing The Possessed or drinking a cup of coffee. Camus does not demand of the reader that attentive solicitude that writers do who have sacrificed their lives to art. The Stranger is just a sheet torn from his life. And since the most absurd life must be that which is most sterile, his novel aims at being magnificently sterile. Art is a futile act of generosity. We need not be too concerned about that, for hidden beneath Camus' paradoxes, I find some of Kant's very wise observations on the endless end of the beautiful. Such, in any event, is The Stranger. A work detached from a life, unjustified and unjustifiable, sterile, fleeting, already forsaken by its author, abandoned for other presents, and that is how we must accept it. As an abrupt communion between two individuals, the author and the reader, beyond reason, in the realm of the absurd. This gives us some indication of how we are to regard the hero of The Stranger. If Camus had wanted to write a novel with a political or social message, it would have been easy for him to portray a civil servant lording it over his family, who's suddenly struck with the intuition of the absurd, which he resists for a while before finally resolving to live out the fundamental absurdity of his condition. The reader would have been convinced right with the character, and for the same reasons. Or he could have related the life of one of those saints of the absurd so dear to his heart, and whom he describes in the myth of Sisyphus, Don Juan, the actor, the conqueror, the creator. But he did not do so, and Meursault, the hero of The Stranger, remains ambiguous, even to readers who are familiar with the theories of the absurd. Naturally, we are assured that he is absurd, and that his dominant character trait is a pitiless lucidity. Besides, in more ways than one, he was created to provide a concerted illustration of the theories presented in the myth of Sisyphus. In the latter work, for example, Camus writes, "A man is more of a man because of what he does not say than what he does say." Meursault personifies this virile silence, this refusal to overindulge in words. He was asked if he had noticed that I was withdrawn, and all he admitted to was that I did not waste words. 2 lines before this, the same witness has just testified that Meursault was a man. He was asked what he meant by that, and he said that everyone knew what he meant. Similarly, in the myth of Sisyphus, Camus expounds on the subject of love. He writes, "We call love that which binds us to certain human beings, based solely on a collective way of seeing for which books and legends are responsible." And in the same vein we read in The Stranger, "So she wanted to know whether I loved her. I answered that it didn't mean anything, but that I probably didn't love her." From this vantage point, the debate that flares in the courtroom and in the reader's mind, did Meursault love his mother, is doubly absurd. First of all, as the lawyer asks, is he accused of having buried his mother or of having killed a man? But the words "to love" are the most meaningless of all. Meursault probably put his mother into a nursing home because he was short of money, and because they had nothing more to say to each other, and he probably did not go to see her often because it wasted his Sunday, not to mention the effort involved in going to the bus station, buying tickets, and taking a 2-hour trip. But what does this mean? Isn't he living entirely in the present, fully indulging his passing moods? What we call a feeling is merely the abstract unity and the meaning of discontinuous impressions. I am not constantly thinking about the people I love, yet I claim to love them even when I am not thinking about them, and I would be capable of compromising my well-being in the name of an abstract feeling in the absence of any real and immediate emotion. Meursault thinks and acts in a different way. He has no desire to know these noble, continuous, and identical feelings. For him, neither love nor even romantic relationships exist. All that counts is the present, the concrete. He goes to see his mother when he feels like it, and that's that. If the desire is there, it will be strong enough to compel him to get on the bus, just as another concrete desire will be strong enough to make this sluggard run at full speed and catch a ride on the back of a moving truck. Yet he still calls his mother by the tender, childish name of Mama, and he never misses a chance to understand her and identify with her. All I know of love is that mixture of desire, tenderness, and intelligence that binds me to a particular being. We thus see that we should not fail to consider the theoretical side of Meursault's character. Similarly, the main purpose of his many adventures is to highlight some aspect or other of the basic absurdity of things. The myth of Sisyphus, for example, extols the sense of perfect freedom experienced by the condemned prisoner for whom, at dawn on an appointed day, the prison doors swing open. In order to make us taste this dawn, this freedom, Camus sentences his hero to capital punishment. "How could I have failed to see," says Meursault, "that nothing was more important than an execution, and that, in a way, it was even the only really worthwhile thing for a man?" We could cite many such examples and quotations. However, this lucid, indifferent, taciturn man was not merely produced to serve a cause. Once the character had been roughly outlined, Meursault probably completed Camus' task himself, already possessed of a substance of his own. Still, his absurdity seems to have been attributed rather than acquired. That is the way he is, and that's that. He does finally get his moment of revelation on the last page, but he has always lived according to Camus' standards. If there were a grace in the realm of the absurd, we would have to say that he has received it. He does not seem to ask himself any of the questions explored in The Myth of Sisyphus. Meursault does not seem to be indignant about his death sentence. He was happy, he did as he liked, and his happiness does not seem to have been affected by any inner gnawing so frequently mentioned by Camus in his essay, which stems from the blinding presence of death. His very indifference often seems like indolence. For instance, on that Sunday when he stays home out of pure laziness and admits to having been a little bored, the character thus remains singularly impenetrable, even from a vantage point of the absurd. He is no Don Juan, no Don Quixote of the absurd. In fact, he often seems more like Sancho Panza. He is there before us, he exists, and we can neither understand nor quite judge him. In a word, he is alive, but his fictional density is the only thing that can make him acceptable to us. However, it would be a mistake to view The Stranger as a completely gratuitous work. As we have said, Camus distinguishes between the feeling and the notion of the absurd. In this respect, he writes, like great works, deep feelings always convey more meaning than they are aware that they do. Intense feelings carry with them their own universe, splendid or wretched, as the case may be. A bit further on he adds, the feeling of the absurd is not the same as the idea of the absurd. The idea is grounded in the feeling. That is all. It does not fully express it. We could say that the aim of The Myth of Sisyphus is to convey the idea of the absurd, and that of The Stranger to convey the feeling. The order in which the two works were published seemed to confirm this theory. The Stranger, the first to appear, plunges us without comment into the climate of the absurd. The essay then arrives to shed light on the landscape. Now, absurdity means divorce, discrepancy. Thus, The Stranger was meant to be a novel of discrepancy, divorce, and disorientation, hence its clever structure. On the one hand, there is the amorphous, everyday flow of reality as it is experienced. And, on the other, the edifying reconstruction of this reality by human reasoning and speech. When first brought face to face with simple reality, the reader confronts it without being able to recognize it in its rational transposition. This is the source of the feeling of the absurd. That is, of our inability to conceive, using our concepts and our words, what occurs in the world. Meursault buries his mother, takes a mistress, and commits a crime. These various facts will be related by witnesses at his trial, and arranged and explained by the public prosecutor. Meursault will have the impression that people are talking about someone else. Everything is orchestrated to lead up to the moment of Marie's sudden outburst. After giving her account on the witness stand, a story composed according to human rules, she bursts into tears and tells the prosecutor that wasn't it, there was something else. He was forcing her to say the opposite of what she really meant. This hall of mirrors has been used frequently since The Counterfeiters, and does not constitute Camus' originality, but the problem to be solved requires him to use an original form. If we are to feel the discrepancy between the prosecutor's conclusions and the actual circumstances of the murder, and if, on finishing the book, we are to retain the impression of an absurd justice that can never comprehend or even confront the deeds it intends to punish, we must first have been placed in contact with reality or with one of these circumstances. But in order to establish this contact, Camus, like the prosecutor, has only words and concepts at his disposal. In assembling his thoughts, he must use words to describe a world that precedes words. The first part of The Stranger could have been given the same title as that of a recent book, Translated from Silence. Here we touch on a disease common to many contemporary writers, the first signs of which I find in the works of Jules Renard. I shall call it the obsession with silence. Paul Hahn would certainly regard it as an effect of literary terrorism. It has taken 1,000 forms, ranging from the Surrealists' automatic writing to Jean-Jacques Bernard's celebrated theater of silence. That is because silence, in the words of Heidegger, is the authentic mode of speech. Only he who can talk keeps silent. Camus talks a great deal. In the myth of Sisyphus, he is downright chatty, yet he reveals his love of silence. He quotes Kierkegaard, "The surest way of being mute is not to hold your tongue, but to talk." And Camus himself adds that a man is more of a man because of what he does not say than what he does say. Thus, in The Stranger, he is attempted to be silent. But how can one be silent with words? How can one convey the unthinkable and disorderly succession of presence through concepts? This challenge involves resorting to a new technique. What is this new technique? I have been told it's Kafka written by Hemingway. I confess that I have found no trace of Kafka in it. Camus' views are wholly of this world. Kafka is the novelist of impossible transcendence. For him, the universe is full of signs that we cannot understand. There is something behind the scenery. For Camus, to the contrary, the tragedy of human existence lies in the absence of any transcendence. I do not know whether this world has a meaning that eludes me, but I do know that I do not know this meaning, and that, for the time being, it is impossible for me to know it. What can a meaning beyond my condition mean to me? I can comprehend only in human terms. I understand what I touch, what offers resistance. He is not concerned, then, with arranging words so as to suggest an inhuman, indecipherable order. The inhuman is merely the disorderly, the mechanical. There is nothing dubious in his work, nothing disquieting, nothing implied. The Stranger gives us a succession of luminously clear views. If they bewilder us, it is only because of their number and the absence of any common link between them. Camus' favorite hours of the day are clear mornings and evenings, and relentless afternoons. His favorite season is Algiers' eternal summer. In his universe, there is scarcely any place for night. When he does speak of it, it is in these terms: I woke up with stars in my face. Country sounds reached my ears. Aromas of night, earth, and salt soothed my temples. The wonderful peace of that sleepy summer invaded me like a tide. The man who wrote these lines is as far removed as possible from the anxieties of a Kafka. He is very much at peace within disorder. The obstinate blindness of nature may irritate, but also comforts him. Its irrationality is merely a negative thing. The absurd man is a humanist. He knows only the good things of this world. The comparison with Hemingway seems more fruitful. There is an evident relationship between the two styles. Equally short sentences can be found in both texts. Each sentence refuses to exploit the momentum gained from the preceding one. Each is a new beginning. Each is like a snapshot of a gesture or an object. With each new gesture and new object comes a new sentence. Nonetheless, I am not fully convinced. The existence of an American narrative technique has unquestionably helped Camus, but, strictly speaking, I doubt whether it has influenced him. Even in Death in the Afternoon, which is not a novel, Hemingway retains that halting style of narration that shoots each separate sentence out of the void with a sort of respiratory spasm. He and his style are interchangeable. We already know that Camus has a different style, a ceremonious one. Yet even in The Stranger, he occasionally raises the tone of his voice. His sentences then take on a larger and more flowing movement. The cry of the paperboy in the already leisurely air, the last birds in the square, the calls of the sandwich vendors, the howl of the trolleys on the high curves of the city, and that distant murmur in the sky just as night begins to spill over the port. All of these seem to be forming a blind man's path that I had known long before entering prison. Beneath the transparency of Meursault's breathless account, I catch a glimpse of a broader underlying poetic prose that is probably Camus' personal mode of expression. If The Stranger exhibits such visible traces of the American technique, it was intentional. Of all the tools at his disposal, Camus chose the one that he felt would serve his purpose best. I doubt whether he will use it again in his future works. Let us examine the plot a little more closely so that we can get a clearer idea of his methods. Men also secrete the inhuman, writes Camus. Sometimes, in moments of lucidity, the mechanical aspect of their gestures and their senseless pantomime make everything around them seem stupid. This quality should be rendered first. From its opening pages, The Stranger puts us in a state of uneasiness as we confront man's inhumanity. But what are the particular instances that may provoke such uneasiness in us? The myth of Sisyphus gives us an example of this. A man is talking on the telephone behind a glass partition. We cannot hear him, but we can see his senseless mimicry. We wonder why he is alive. We immediately know the answer, almost too well, for the example reveals a certain bias in the author. The gesturing of a man on the telephone, whom you cannot hear, is really only relatively absurd, because it is part of an incomplete circuit. But if you open the booth door and then put your ear to the receiver, the circuit is complete, and the human activity makes sense again. In honesty, therefore, one would have to say that there are only relative absurdities that exist solely in relation to absolute rationalities. However, we are dealing with a matter not of honesty, but of art. Camus has a method in mind. He is going to insert a glass partition between the reader and his characters. Does anything look more foolish than men behind a glass window? Glass seems to let everything through. It blocks only one thing, the meaning of their gestures. The glass still needs to be chosen. It will be the stranger's consciousness, which is really transparent, since we see everything it sees. However, it is designed in such a way that things are transparent and meanings opaque. From then on, everything happened very quickly. The men went up to the coffin with a sheet. The priest, his attendants, the director, and I went outside. In front of the door was a lady whom I didn't know. Monsieur Marceau, said the director. I didn't catch the lady's name, and gathered only that she was a nurse who had been ordered to be present. Without smiling, she nodded her long, bony face. Then we stood aside to make room for the body to pass. Some men are dancing behind a glass partition. A consciousness has been interposed between them and the reader. Something insignificant. A translucent curtain. A pure passivity that records all the facts. And there you have it. Precisely because it is passive, this consciousness records only the facts. The reader is unaware of this insertion. But what is this assumption implied by this kind of narrative technique? In short, what had once been melodic structure had been transformed into a sum of invariant elements. Supposedly, this succession of movements is rigorously identical with the act considered as a whole. Are we not dealing here with the analytical assumption that any reality is reducible to a sum of elements? Although analysis may be the instrument of science, it is also the instrument of humor. If, in wishing to describe a rugby match, I write, I saw adults in shorts fighting and throwing themselves on the ground in order to send a leather ball between a pair of wooden posts, I have summed up what I saw, but I have deliberately omitted giving the facts any meaning. I was being humorous. Camus' story is analytical and humorous. Like all artists, he lies because he pretends to reproduce raw experience, and because he slyly filters out all of the meaningful links that are also part of the experience. That is what Hume did when he stated that he could find nothing in experience but isolated impressions. That is what today's American neorealists are still doing when they deny the existence of anything other than external relations between phenomena. By contrast, contemporary philosophy has established that meanings are also part of immediate data, but exploring this would take us too far afield. Let us simply indicate that the absurd man's universe is the neorealist's analytical world. This method has proved its worth in literature. It was used in Voltaire's Ingénu and Micromégas, as well as in Swift's Gulliver's Travels. For the 18th century had its own strangers, in the form of noble savages, who, when transported to an unknown civilization, would perceive facts before they could grasp their meaning. Was not the effect of this discrepancy precisely to arouse in the reader the feeling of the absurd? Camus seems to have recalled this on several occasions, particularly when he shows us his hero reflecting on the reasons for his imprisonment. However, it is this analytical process that explains the use of the American technique in The Stranger. The presence of death at the end of our road has made our future go up in smoke. Our life has no tomorrow. It is merely a series of instants. What can this mean if not that the absurd man is applying his analytical mind to time? Where Bergson saw a structure that could not be broken down, Camus perceives only a series of instants. It is the plurality of incommunicable moments that will finally account for the plurality of beings. What our author borrows from Hemingway is thus the discontinuity between clipped sentences that imitate the discontinuity of time. We are now better prepared to understand the slice of life style of his narrative. Each sentence is a present instant, but not an indecisive one, that stands out and remains with us long enough to affect the following one. Each sentence is clear, flawless, and self-contained. It is separated by a void from the following one, just as Descartes' instant is distinct from one following it. The world is destroyed and reborn from one sentence to the next. When speech makes its appearance, it is a creation ex nihilo. The sentences in The Stranger are islands. We tumble from sentence to sentence, from nothingness to nothingness. In order to emphasize the isolation of each sentence unit, Camus has chosen to tell his story in the present perfect tense. The simple past is the tense of continuity. He walked a long time. These words refer us to a pluperfect, to a future. The reality of the sentence is the verb, the act, with its transitive character and its transcendence. He has walked a long time dissimulates the verbality of the verb. The verb is broken, split in two. On the one hand, we find a past participle that has lost all transcendence and is as inert as an object. On the other, we find the verb être, which possesses only a copulative sense and joins the participle to the substantive, like the attribute to the subject. The transitive nature of the verb has vanished, and the sentence has frozen. Its reality is now the noun. Instead of acting as a bridge between past and future, it is merely a small, isolated, self-sufficient substance. If, in addition to all the rest, we were careful to reduce the sentence as much as possible to the main proposition, its internal structure would achieve perfect simplicity and thereby gain cohesiveness. It becomes truly indivisible, an atom of time. The sentences are not, of course, arranged in relation to each other, they are simply juxtaposed. All causal links are carefully avoided, since they would introduce in the narrative the kernel of an explanation, and, between instants, an order other than that of pure succession. Consider this passage. She asked me, a moment later, if I loved her. I answered that it didn't mean anything, but I probably didn't love her. She looked sad, but while preparing lunch, for no reason at all, she suddenly laughed in such a way that I kissed her. Just then the noise of an argument broke out at Raymond's place. We have cited two sentences that conceal, as unobtrusively as possible, a causal link under the mere appearance of succession. When it is absolutely necessary to allude to a preceding sentence, the author uses words like and, but, then, and just then, which evoke nothing but disjunction, opposition, or mere addition. The relations between these temporal unities are external, like those that the neorealists established between objects. Reality appears on the scene with no introduction, and disappears without being destroyed. The world dissolves and is reborn with each pulsation of time. But we must not think it generates itself, for it is inert. Any activity on its part would tend to substitute formidable forces for the reassuring disorder created by chance. A 19th century naturalist would have written, "A bridge spanned the river." Camus will have none of this anthropomorphism. He will say, "Over the river there was a bridge." That way, we immediately sense the object's passivity. It is there, plain and undifferentiated. There were 4 men in black in the room. In front of the door was a lady I didn't know. In front of the door, the hearse was waiting. Standing next to the hearse was the director. People used to say that Jules Renard would end by writing, "The hen is laying an egg." Camus and many other contemporary writers would write, "There is the hen, and she is laying an egg." That is because they like things for their own sake and do not want to dilute them in the flux of duration. There is water. In this we hold a small piece of eternity. Passive, impenetrable, incommunicable, and gleaming. What a sensual delight, if we could only touch it. To the absurd man, this is the only good thing in this world. That is why the novelist prefers this transient twinkling of tiny sparkles, each bringing us to a moment of pleasure, to an organized narrative. This is what leads Camus to think that in writing The Stranger, he remains silent. His sentence does not belong to the universe of discourse. It has neither ramifications nor extensions, nor internal structure. Like Valerie's sylph, it might be defined as, on the sly, a bare breast glimpsed between an open shirt. Its exact measure corresponds to the duration of a silent intuition. In such terms, can we speak of the body of Camus' novel as constituting something whole? All the sentences in his book equate to the same thing, as do all of the absurd man's experiences. Each one stands on its own and projects the others into the void. Yet, as a result, no single one of them stands out, except for the rare moments in which the author, abandoning his own principles, indulges in poetry. Even dialogues are integrated into the narrative. Dialogue is the moment of explanation, of meaning, and to privilege it in any way would be to acknowledge that meanings exist. Instead, Camus shortens dialogue, compresses it, and often expresses it in the form of indirect discourse, stripping it of all typographic prominence in such a way that spoken phrases appear to have no more significance than narrative descriptions. They flash for an instant and then disappear, like lightning, or like a sound or an odor. Thus, when you start reading the book, you feel as if you were listening to a monotonous, nasal Arab chant rather than reading a novel. You may expect the novel to be like one of those melodies Coeur describes which disappear and never return, and which come to a sudden stop for some unknown reason. But the work gradually takes shape on its own before the reader's eyes, revealing its solid substructure. There is not a single unnecessary detail, not one that is not brought up again later on and used in the trial proceedings. And when we close the book, we realize that it could not have had any other beginning or any other ending. In this world that has been carefully stripped of its causality and presented as absurd, the slightest incident counts. There is not a single one of them that does not help to lead the hero to crime and capital punishment. The Stranger is a classical work, a clearly orchestrated work, composed about and against the absurd. Was this really what the author set out to do? I do not know. I am simply presenting my opinion as a reader. How are we to categorize this clear-cut work, so carefully composed beneath its apparent disorder? So human, so obvious, too, once you have the key? It cannot be called a story, for a story explains and coordinates as it narrates. It substitutes causal order for chronological sequence. Camus calls it a novel, yet a novel requires continuous duration, development, and the manifest presence of irreversible time. It is not without hesitation that I would use the term novel for this succession of inert presence that allows us to see from underneath the mechanical economy of a deliberately staged piece of writing. Or, if it is a novel, then it is a novel in the manner of Zadig and Candide, a short moralistic novel, one with ironic portraits and a hint of satire, a novel that, despite the influence of German existentialists and American novelists, ultimately remains reminiscent of a tale by Voltaire.